Section 10 of The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Oxenhandler. Book 3. The Classification and Description of the Different Kinds of Crowds. Chapter 1. The Classification of Crowds. The general divisions of crowds, their classification. 1. Heterogeneous crowds. Different varieties of them. The influence of race. The spirit of the crowd is weak in proportion as the spirit of the race is strong. The spirit of the race represents the civilized state, and the spirit of the crowd the barbarian state. Homogeneous crowds, their different varieties, sects, castes, and classes. We have sketched in this work the general characteristics common to psychological crowds. It remains to point out the particular characteristics which accompany those of a general order in the different categories of collectivities, when they are transformed into a crowd under the influences of the proper exciting causes. We will, first of all, set forth in a few words a classification of crowds. Our starting point will be the simple multitude. Its most inferior form is met with when the multitude is composed of individuals belonging to different races. In this case, its only common bond of union is the will, more or less respected, of a chief. The barbarians of very diverse origin who during several centuries invaded the Roman Empire may be cited as a specimen of multitudes of this kind. On a higher level than these multitudes composed of different races are those which, under certain influences, have acquired common characteristics, and have ended by forming a single race. They present at times characteristics peculiar to crowds, but these characteristics are overruled to a greater or less extent by racial considerations. These two kinds of multitudes may, under certain influences investigated in this work, be transformed into organized or psychological crowds. We shall break up these organized crowds into the following divisions. A. Heterogeneous crowds. 1. A. Anonymous crowds, street crowds, for example. 2. A. Crowds not anonymous, juries, parliamentary assemblies, etc. B. Homogeneous crowds. 1. B. Sects, political sects, religious sects, etc. 2. B. Castes, the military caste, the priestly caste, the working caste, etc. 3. B. Classes, the middle classes, the peasant classes, etc. We will point out briefly the distinguishing characteristics of these different categories of crowds. 1. Heterogeneous crowds. It is these collectivities whose characteristics have been studied in this volume. They are composed of individuals of any description, of any profession, and any degree of intelligence. We are now aware that by the mere fact that men form part of a crowd engaged in action, their collective psychology differs essentially from their individual psychology, and their intelligence is affected by this differentiation. We have seen that intelligence is without influence in collectivities, they being solely under the sway of unconscious sentiments. A fundamental factor, that of race, allows a tolerably thorough differentiation of the various heterogeneous crowds. We have often referred already to the part played by race, and have shown it to be the most powerful of the factors capable of determining men's actions. Its action is also to be traced in the character of crowds. A crowd composed of individuals assembled at haphazard, but all of them Englishmen or Chinamen, will differ widely from another crowd also composed of individuals of any and every description, but of other races, Russians, Frenchmen, or Spaniards, for example. The wide divergencies which their inherited mental constitution creates in men's modes of feeling and thinking at once come into prominence when, which rarely happens, circumstances gather together in the same crowd and in fairly equal proportions individuals of different nationality, and this occurs, however identical in appearance be the interests which provoked the gathering. The efforts made by the socialists to assemble in great congresses the representatives of the working class populations of different countries have always ended in the most pronounced discord. A Latin crowd, however revolutionary or however conservative it be supposed, will invariably appeal to the intervention of the state to realize its demands. It is always distinguished by a marked tendency towards centralization, and by a leaning more or less pronounced in favour of a dictatorship. An English or an American crowd, on the contrary, sets no store on the state and only appeals to private initiative. A French crowd lays particular weight on equality, and an English crowd on liberty. These differences of race explain how it is that there are almost as many different forms of socialism and democracy as there are nations. The genius of the race, then, exerts a paramount influence upon the dispositions of a crowd. It is the powerful underlying force that limits its changes of humour. It should be considered as an essential law that the inferior characteristics of crowds are the less accentuated in proportion as the spirit of the race is strong. The crowd state and the domination of crowds is equivalent to the barbarian state, or to a return to it. It is by the acquisition of a solidly constituted collective spirit that the race frees itself to a greater and greater extent from the unreflecting power of crowds, and emerges from the barbarian state. The only important classification to be made of heterogeneous crowds, apart from that based on racial considerations, is to separate them into anonymous crowds, such as street crowds, and crowds not anonymous, deliberative assemblies and juries, for example. The sentiment of responsibility absent from crowds of the first description and developed in those of the second often gives a very different tendency to their respective acts. 2. Homogeneous crowds. Homogeneous crowds include 1. Sects, 2. Castes, 3. Classes. The sect represents the first step in the process of organization of homogeneous crowds. A sect includes individuals differing greatly as to their education, their professions, and the class of society to which they belong, and with their common beliefs as the connecting link. Examples in point are religious and political sects. The caste represents the highest degree of organization of which the crowd is susceptible, while the sect includes individuals of very different professions, degrees of education, and social surrounding, who are only linked together by the beliefs they hold in common. The caste is composed of individuals of the same profession, and in consequence similarly educated and of much the same social status. Examples in point are the military and priestly castes. The class is formed of individuals of diverse origin, linked together not by a community of beliefs as are the members of a sect, or by common professional occupations as are the members of a caste, but by certain interests and certain habits of life and education almost identical. The middle class and the agricultural class are examples. Being only concerned in this work with heterogeneous crowds, and reserving the study of homogeneous crowds, sects, castes, and classes for another volume, I shall not insist here on the characteristics of crowds of this latter kind. I shall conclude this study of heterogeneous crowds by the examination of a few typical and distinct categories of crowds. End of section 10. Section 11 of The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Oxenhandler. Book 3, Chapter 2. Crowds termed criminal crowds. Crowds termed criminal crowds. A crowd may be legally, yet not psychologically, criminal. The absolute unconsciousness of the acts of crowds. Various examples. Psychology of the authors of the September massacres. Their reasoning, their sensibility, their ferocity, and their morality. Owing to the fact that crowds, after a period of excitement, enter upon a purely automatic and unconscious state in which they are guided by suggestion, it seems difficult to qualify them in any case as criminal. I only retain this erroneous qualification because it has been definitely brought into vogue by recent psychological investigations. Certain acts of crowds are assuredly criminal, if considered merely in themselves, but criminal in that case in the same way as the act of a tiger devouring a Hindu after allowing its young to maul him for their amusement. The usual motive of the crimes of crowds is a powerful suggestion, and the individuals who take part in such crimes are afterwards convinced that they have acted in obedience to duty, which is far from being the case with the ordinary criminal. The history of the crimes committed by crowds illustrates what precedes. The murder of M. de Launay, the governor of the Bastille, may be cited as a typical example. After the taking of the fortress, the governor, surrounded by a very excited crowd, was dealt blows from every direction. It was proposed to hang him, to cut off his head, to tie him to a horse's tail. While struggling, he accidentally kicked one of those present. Someone proposed, and his suggestion was at once received with acclamation by the crowd, that the individual who had been kicked should cut the governor's throat. Quote, The individual in question, a cook out of work, whose chief reason for being at the Bastille was idle curiosity as to what was going on, esteems that, since such is the general opinion, the action is patriotic, and even believes he deserves a medal for having destroyed a monster. With the sword that is lent him he strikes the bared neck, but the weapon being somewhat blunt and not cutting, he takes from his pocket a small black-handled knife, and, in his capacity of cook he would be experienced in cutting up meat, successfully effects the operation." Unquote. The working of the process indicated above is clearly seen in this example. We have obedience to a suggestion, which is all the stronger because of its collective origin, and the murderer's conviction that he has committed a very meritorious act, a conviction the more natural seeing that he enjoys the unanimous approval of his fellow citizens. An act of this kind may be considered crime legally, but not psychologically. The general characteristics of criminal crowds are precisely the same as those we have met with in all crowds: openness to suggestion, credulity, mobility, the exaggeration of the sentiments good or bad, the manifestation of certain forms of morality, etc. We shall find all these characteristics present in a crowd which has left behind it in French history the most sinister memories, the crowd which perpetrated the September massacres. In point of fact, it offers much similarity with the crowd that committed the St. Bartholomew massacres. I borrow the details from the narration of M. Taine, who took them from contemporary sources. It is not known exactly who gave the order or made the suggestion to empty the prisons by massacring the prisoners. Whether it was Danton, as is probable, or another does not matter. The one interesting fact for us is the powerful suggestion received by the crowd charged with the massacre. The crowd of murderers numbered some 300 persons and was a perfectly typical heterogeneous crowd. With the exception of a very small number of professional scoundrels, it was composed in the main of shopkeepers and artisans of every trade, bootmakers, locksmiths, hairdressers, masons, clerks, messengers, etc. Under the influence of the suggestion received, they are perfectly convinced, as was the cook referred to above, that they are accomplishing a patriotic duty. They fill a double office, being at once judge and executioner, but they do not for a moment regard themselves as criminals. Deeply conscious of the importance of their duty, they begin by forming a sort of tribunal, and in connection with this act the ingenuousness of crowds and their rudimentary conception of justice are seen immediately. In consideration of the large number of the accused, it is decided that, to begin with, the nobles, priests, officers, and members of the king's household, in a word, all the individuals whose mere profession is proof of their guilt in the eyes of a good patriot, shall be slaughtered in a body, there being no need for a special decision in their case. The remainder shall be judged on their personal appearance and their reputation. In this way the rudimentary conscience of the crowd is satisfied. It will now be able to proceed legally with the massacre, and to give free scope to those instincts of ferocity whose genesis I have set forth elsewhere, they being instincts which collectivities always have it in them to develop to a high degree. These instincts, however, as is regularly the case in crowds, will not prevent the manifestation of other and contrary sentiments, such as tender-heartedness, often as extreme as the ferocity. Quote, "They have the expansive sympathy and prompt sensibility of the Parisian working man. At the Abbaye, one of the federates, learning that the prisoners had been left without water for 26 hours, was bent on putting the gaoler to death, and would have done so but for the prayers of the prisoners themselves. When a prisoner is acquitted by the improvised tribunal, everyone, guards and slaughterers included, embraces him with transports of joy and applauds frantically." Unquote. After which the wholesale massacre is recommenced. During its progress a pleasant gaiety never ceases to reign. There is dancing and singing around the corpses, and benches are arranged, quote, "for the ladies," unquote, delighted to witness the killing of aristocrats. The exhibition continues, moreover, of a special description of justice. A slaughterer at the Abbaye having complained that the ladies placed at a little distance saw badly, and that only a few of those present had the pleasure of striking the aristocrats, the justice of the observation is admitted, and it is decided that the victims shall be made to pass slowly between two rows of slaughterers, who shall be under the obligation to strike with the back of the sword only so as to prolong the agony. At the prison de la Force the victims are stripped stark naked and literally "carved," for half an hour, after which, when everyone has had a good view, they are finished off by a blow that lays bare their entrails. The slaughterers, too, have their scruples, and exhibit that moral sense whose existence in crowds we have already pointed out. They refuse to appropriate the money and jewels of the victims, taking them to the table of the committees. Those rudimentary forms of reasoning characteristic of the mind of crowds are always to be traced in all their acts. Thus, after the slaughter of the 1200 or 1500 enemies of the nation, some one makes the remark, and his suggestion is at once adopted, that the other prisons, those containing aged beggars, vagabonds, and young prisoners, hold in reality useless mouths, of which it would be well on that account to get rid. Besides, among them there should certainly be enemies of the people. A woman of the name of Delarue, for instance, the widow of a poisoner, "She must be furious at being in prison. If she could, she would set fire to Paris. She must have said so. She has said so. Another good riddance." The demonstration appears convincing, and the prisoners are massacred without exception, included in the number being some 50 children of from 12 to 17 years of age, who, of course, might themselves have become enemies of the nation, and of whom in consequence it was clearly well to be rid. At the end of a week's work, all these operations being brought to an end, the slaughterers can think of reposing themselves. Profoundly convinced that they have deserved well of their country, they went to the authorities and demanded a recompense. The most zealous went so far as to claim a medal. The history of the Commune of 1871 affords several facts analogous to those which precede. Given the growing influence of crowds and the successive capitulations before them of those in authority, we are destined to witness many others of a like nature. End of section 11.